All right, we're on pages 26 and 27 of the syllabus having to do with textual criticism. Remember last time we left off talking about the text as we have it in Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensis, taking a look on the screen up there to show you exactly what parts of the text are present, where the body of the text is located, the Mesora Magna, which is an indication of some of the lists that the Masoretes kept that would help you to identify where else a particular form is found. And then the textual critical apparatus is the editor's decisions with regard to how the textual evidence should be interpreted and how reading should be given. I'll just warn you that the textual critical apparatus in Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia is extremely suspect, extremely inaccurate, and some Hebrew professors absolutely refuse to give any assignments on textual criticism that deal with the textual critical apparatus in Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. A brand new edition is being produced as we speak. The 18th fascicle has been published at a cost of about $100 if you want to buy this. It's $100, and all you get is Ruth, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther. And it's called Biblia Hebraica Quinta for the 5th major edition. Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia comprises both the 3rd and the 4th editions and has gone through a number of editions itself. And then before that was Biblia Hebraica Kittel was what it was called, BHK. And that also had a textual critical apparatus that garnered a lot of criticism from the Hebraeus. For example, in our textual criticism course in the THM program this morning, we were talking about a problem in Ruth chapter 4, verse 4. And in Ruth chapter 4, verse 4, we have a problem there in the textual critical apparatus. It says, do you read it, he will redeem, or do you read it, you will redeem? Two totally different verb forms in the Hebrew text. The textual critical apparatus in Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia says that a multitude or 20 or more medieval Hebrew manuscripts plus all the ancient versions, the Greek Septuagint, the Latin Vulgate, the Syriac Pashita, and the Aramaic Targums support the change to you will redeem. That is absolutely erroneous. It is not accurate whatsoever. In Quinta now, those two notations are totally gone. There is no notation about a multitude of medieval Hebrew manuscripts, even though over 50 medieval Hebrew manuscripts have that reading of you. In investigating those manuscripts, they are part of either a single or dual tradition and are copies of the same manuscript ultimately, or are of such low value because of the many errors in them that they're worthless, and all of the major primary manuscripts that are witnesses to the medieval Hebrew manuscripts read as the Masoretic text has it. And as far as the versions are concerned, only the Greek Septuagint and the Syriac Pashita offer a viable support for the second person reading, you will redeem. The Vulgate and the Targums are not good arguments. They could be argued that way, but they are more than likely the result of trying to deal with what they saw in the text as we have it, the third person masculine singular that has to do with he will redeem. And so in Quinta now, that has totally changed. It says nothing about medieval Hebrew manuscripts at all, because there is no viable testimony or witness there. It puts the Greek Septuagint and the Syriac Pashita as evidence, and then puts the other two, the Targum and the Vulgate, in parenthesis to indicate that they're secondary. They do not direct witnesses to the supposed text change. And the editor of the Ruth manuscript, the Ruth text in Quinta, himself says in the textual commentary that it is quite unlikely that that text should be changed. In fact, he goes on to really say that it is the only possible text in the entire book of Ruth that might even be considered for change. The text is so solid and so well attested that there is no need to change the Masoretic text in the book of Ruth whatsoever. Now, one of the books I recommend to you for textual criticism is this one by Ellis Brotzman. It is one of the required texts in our THM program in Old Testament. When we get to Old Testament textual criticism, the fellows have to read this in the first 4 weeks of the course as a basic introduction. And one of the things Brotzman does is he goes through the book of Ruth and looks at every major textual problem in the book of Ruth, discusses them, and then makes a decision. I agree with all that he has except for 3 instances. His choice in Ruth 4:4 that we were just talking about, he chooses to amend. And he has 2 emendations in Ruth 4 verse 5, which I would also disagree with, and which Devard disagrees with as well. So it's one of those things that I think that when Brotzman revises or redoes this volume, I think he will then take the stance that Devard has, and you will find no textual emendations in here in the book of Ruth in the future. I'm confident that the integrity and the care with which he worked through the rest of the text of Ruth and the way he discussed those 3 problems where he did choose an emendation when this book was first published, which was in 1994. I believe that now with this 2004 publication of Biblia Hebraica Quinta, that he will change his mind and decide that there is no basis for any textual emendation in the book at all. But that's just to give you an idea and also let you know that this textual critical apparatus in BHS, in Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, is not dependable. If you ever do any exegetical research, textual research, and using Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, try to back up and check every single thing you find, because over 50% of the textual apparatus is erroneous, inaccurate, misleading, and non-dependable. PJ?
Would you have agreed with Brotzman before Quinta came out?
No, I did not agree with Brotzman. In fact, for the last 10 years, I've been teaching that I disagreed with him on those 3 points before this. And this 2004 came out. I got it just last year at the regional ETS in San Diego and was surprised to find out that the position I had taken is exactly what Jean Devard had taken. In fact, he gave many of the same arguments. Question?
Yeah, I was, correct me if I'm wrong, Mesora Magna and Mesora Parva were put together by the Masoretes.
Correct.
The textual critical apparatus, I remember in Hebrew actually you'd say it was padded by using Greek manuscripts and things like that really aren't helping the case any. But who puts together the text critical apparatus?
The question is, who puts together the text critical apparatus for Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia? Individual editors. Those editors are listed on the back of the title page. For example, we're looking here at Joshua. For Joshua and Judges, Rudolf Meyer did the textual critical apparatus in 1972. And so they are individuals who are making those decisions themselves about it. In this, on Ruth, Jean Devard did the textual critical apparatus on Ruth in Biblia Hebraica Quinta. Dirksen did it on Song of Solomon, Goldman on Ecclesiastes, Schaeffer on Lamentations, and Saibo on Esther. So that's individual editors perform and create the textual critical apparatus.
So when the text is found, all you have is Mesora Parva and Mesora Magna.
Correct. The manuscripts do not contain textual critical apparatus. Okay? Question?
Where else are we to look outside of BHS for textual critical information? Just exegetical commentaries or?
Okay, good question. Where do you look for other information on textual critical problems? As you mentioned, Steve, you look at the textual critical commentaries, like International Critical Commentary Series, Hermeneia. Those are 2 very good ones to go to for textual critical problems. Not necessarily from the decisions they make, because they often make a decision that follows conjectural emendation and have liberal philosophies with regard to textual critical analysis, but for the data they provide. They will give you the data you need then to take and make a decision. So you would go there. There are also other sources. For example, Hebrew University Bible Project is available in Isaiah and Jeremiah and I think the Minor Prophets now. That is a full textual critical apparatus. We'll be looking at a little bit here later on to show you what that's like. That is a good place to go. It's based upon the Aleppo Codex. Then there now is Quinta. And within the next 10 years, they should have pretty much of Quinta finished and done, to where 10 years from now, seminary students will not be using Stuttgartensia, they'll be using Quinta. This will be changed and modified. The textual commentary that are in these paperback volumes will be omitted and put in a separate volume. And then the text and the textual critical apparatus will be combined into one volume like we have now for Stuttgartensia. And it is very dependable. They've done an excellent job. It's the first time in over 100 years that we have had a viable textual critical edition providing us with adequate data to be able to make accurate decisions. Okay. Any other questions there? Yes?
Could you please give that Ruth reference again? And also, do you believe he will redeem is correct?
Okay, which Ruth reference?
You will redeem.
Okay, the reference that I was talking about was Ruth 4:4. Ruth 4:4. The difference between whether you will redeem or he will redeem. The text currently has he will redeem. And so the suggestion in Stuttgartensia by Meyer was that it should be changed to you will redeem. All right? Let's move on then. Remember, we talked about the added text in the middle of Joshua chapter 21, these two verses, verses 36 and 37, that were left out by the Leningrad Codex scribe and were added in by the editors of Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, and they put it in small type to indicate that they were the ones who added it. As we said last week, you pass on the text like you received it. You don't make changes in the text except a major change like this, where it is very obvious internally, externally, and universally in all the witnesses that this was a singular error by one scribe, the scribe of Codex Leningradensis B19a. Then the Mesora Parva in the margin. We talked briefly about some of these. We talked about this one using kol, how that use of kol or all that we see up there is the first word, and the text says 9 times at the beginning of a verse in this book. And as we looked at that and saw that as it's given and how it's indicated by the circules, and then the circule after that over the makef, that indicates that the two words it combines, the kol ahead of it and arim after it, all the cities, occurs 3 times in the Hebrew Bible in just exactly that form. And then the number 14 is a reference to the Mesora Magna, and it gives a number there of 1,361. So you go then to the volume of these lists that's put together, compiled by Gerard Weil. You go to list number 1,361, and it'll tell you where those 3 occurrences take place. So you can find them and look at them. And as I mentioned last week, these were all done in order to protect the text. The Masoretes considered themselves custodians of the text as traditionally pronounced, as traditionally proclaimed and read, and their adding of the vowel pointings and of the accents were all done in order to preserve what had been traditionally handed down. They worked in a period of time when many Jews no longer knew Hebrew. They had been scattered from the land of Israel. They'd been scattered throughout the world, large numbers of them located in Central Europe, and they learned the languages of the peoples around them, kind of created a form of language that combined Hebrew, Aramaic, and a language like Polish or German and what is called Yiddish, and utilized that. But classical Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, was known by very few. There were even some rabbis that had very little knowledge of biblical Hebrew. And the concern was that it would be lost if they didn't do something. They had to do something so that future generations, even if they hadn't the depth of training to be able to memorize all the Old Testament and all of its readings and repeat it orally, they would have a text that would tell them how to pronounce it, even if they no longer spoke Hebrew. And that way the text would be protected. They were called Masoretes because the term Mesora means tradition. and they were the ones who were putting a fence around, protecting and guarding the traditional reading and pronunciation of the Hebrew text. All the Mesora Parva here in the margin are those clues that they need to protect the text in those specific cases, especially since experience had taught them that scribes tended to make mistakes with those particular examples. And that's the way the Mesora Parva grew. They kept adding to the number of mistakes that were commonly made by scribes. And it became a body of evidence to test and check a manuscript to see if it was worth using in the synagogue, if it was accurate enough. That's the purpose of the Mesora Parva. You'll notice here a two-layered reference just below that second green arrow. You can see here the Gimel, Waw, Lamed, and Nun Sofit, and a Kof with a dot over it. That is not a number in that case. Once in the two-storied element, that is what we call a kare. Kare is from the Hebrew word kara and the Aramaic kare. And it means to read, to read. You're used to translating kara as he named, he called. It's also he read. In the Aramaic, it has the same range of meanings. And so it means read. The text that is found in the body is called the kathiv. Kathiv is an Aramaic passive participle that means written. It's the equivalent of katuv in Hebrew, the kal passive participle. And so it means written. So this is a debate here about kathiv and kare. And so it's often called the kathiv kare. So when someone sees this, they say, here's a kathiv kare problem. So the kare says, or at least we were taught at one time, said, instead of reading what is written, read this in place of it. Now that's what I was taught in seminary. That has now changed. James Barr, John Walton, a large number of others, beginning back with Ginsburg, had begun to see that there were some problems with having this kind of interpretation of the kathiv kare, that it did not seem to match at times. It seemed that perhaps there was a different meaning to it. And now the move is on to indicate that what it really is saying is, you may have heard it said that it should be read this way, the way it's written in the margin, but don't you dare change it the way it's written. In other words, it's a stronger protection and a stronger argument, and is especially applied, depending on the manuscripts, anywhere from just over 700 times in the Old Testament to a maximum of 1,500 times in the Old Testament, that this is found in special cases where the scribes would be most likely to make a change that is definitely forbidden by the Masoretic tradition. And that's what we're coming down to. It's moving now to where almost 50% of all Hebraists have adopted that as the explanation of the kathiv kare. I just saw another article of the day published in a journal that took the same road and the same interpretation. So as you look at this one, and you look at the text itself, and you see that in the text it has, the kathiv is a gimel with a holem, a lamed, a kametz, a waw, and a nun. You look at that and you say, Golan, well, a kametz waw is kind of unusual spelling. We're used to seeing a holem waw. And so that's why you have the text in the margin. Because you'll see there that's the gimel waw, and that'd be the holem waw, and it'd be representing the lamed, the kametz, and the nun. It still is pronounced the same, Golan. It doesn't change pronunciation. It does not change the meaning. But the argument here by the Masoretes is evidently that just because it's spelled in an unusual fashion does not mean it should be altered, that that's the way it was originally spelled. And it could be that someday we may find a text, maybe extra biblical, in another language, Eblaite or Ugaritic, that might spell Golan from the same period of time, from the 15th century BC to the 14th century BC, that might spell it the same way, with a waw following the lamed rather than preceding it. It may be a very legitimate, original, and historically accurate contextual reading and spelling. So the Masoretes, if we take this interpretation that is now becoming popular, are saying, don't you dare change that. You've heard that it ought to be changed to this, that it ought to be textually updated, that it ought to be put in modern spelling. Don't you dare touch it. Leave it alone. Keep it as it is. And that shows you a little bit of the spirit of the Masoretes. Their desire was to keep inviolate, to keep that text unchanged and unaltered. And that's the reason for all of those notations. And as the studies go on, as we learn more about the Mesora and the Messora Parva, I think that we will gain a greater and greater appreciation of it. And as we go through the lectures with regard to textual criticism, and I describe for you the entire history of the text, of the Hebrew Bible, I think will have a higher appreciation for the job that they did. And we'll be talking about them a lot more as we go along this week and next week. Let's move on then. Just going to skip over some of these, just give you 2 examples of readings in the Mesora Parva. The numbers, for example, to use 30, you have to use a kaf and a yod with dots over it, because the lamed with a dot over it is the symbol for a hapax legomenon. Hapax in Greek means once, legomenon means spoken. Spoken once. It occurs once. It's the only occurrence. And when it's done that way in the Masoretic text, it has to do with the exact form you see on the page, with any suffixes, prefixes, with any infixes, with the vowel pointings, with the accents. It is exactly that form they're talking about. They're not saying the root word is found only once. They're saying this exact form is found only once. And the same for other figures. When they talk about something being found 3 times, or 9 times, or 16 times, they mean exactly this way. It's not just the root. It's not like a concordance that is to tell you, okay, this is how many times it occurs in the entire Old Testament for this word. Don't be caught up in that. It's this form of the word that is found, because it's for preserving it exactly as it ought to be pronounced, so that it is accurate in every detail. So since the lamed is used, which is an abbreviation of the Aramaic la'ep, which means no other, then the lamed is out as used for 30. And that's what it would be. Aleph is 1, Beth is 2, Gimel is 3, etc. You get down to Yod, that's 10. And you go from the Yod, you go to the Kaf, which is 20. And so here, 20 plus 10, Kaf plus Yod, each of them with a dot over it, is how you do 30 then, instead of using the lamed, which would normally be 30. But if you have 31, you can use lamed aleph. You can use lamed aleph for that. And then to give you another example, this abbreviation is for minhon, which in Aramaic means of them or from them. And for an example here, in 1 Kings 9:9, the Mesora Parva has a hey with a dot, which means 5 times. The chos is for chasa, which has the idea of lacking, which means defectively written. And the 3 times is the gimel with the dot over it. 3 times of them, minhon there, is then 3 of them. 5 times defectively written, 3 of them in the prophets, and every case in the Torah is like it except 2. And it's referring to the word Ebvotham, their fathers. The holem here, written with a holem wow, is the full writing rather than the defective writing. And so they're telling you exactly how many times this exact form, their fathers, occurs, 5 times, and 5 times defective, and 3 of these are in the prophets, and all of them in the Torah except for 2. So as you go through and you read all those, you can find out a lot of information. If you learn how to read the Mesora Parva, you will have some examples of sources, of references that you don't have to run to concordance. You say, I want to know how many times Ebvotham is found in the Old Testament this way. You've got it right there in your Hebrew Bible. Or it may be some other word. You want to find out how many times it is exactly that way, and maybe in the margin it says that lamed, and you know that only occurs 1 time. And you go to the lexicon, you may find the root occurs 5 times, and yet this form is only once. If you go to Evan Shoshan's concordance, you find it confirmed only 1 time. And you can find out exactly where that's at by the mark in the margin. Even down to the kind of accent. This is a bete amin, which has the idea of with this accent. And I'll just skip over that. You don't need to go through these in detail. We cover them in OT 603, an Introduction to Hebrew Exegesis. The medieval Hebrew manuscripts, the major manuscripts, are indicated in the textual critical apparatus by abbreviations. MS means manuscript singular. When it is found in the textual critical apparatus on the line of the text, not as a superscript, it means medieval Hebrew manuscripts. MSS is the plural. It's manuscripts. If you see PC MSS, that means a few medieval Hebrew manuscripts, which means 3 to 10. In 1st and 2nd Samuel, however, it means 3 to 6. If you have NONN, that stands for Noni manuscripts. The previous was Pauci, using the Latin abbreviations here. Means a few, 11 to 20, and some, 11 to 20, or in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 7 to 15. And MLT is multi manuscripts, many, 20 plus. 20 plus everywhere except 1st and 2nd Samuel, where it means 16 to 60 medieval Hebrew manuscripts. It's not referring to anything else except medieval Hebrew manuscripts. The Middle Ages is where we get the term medieval. The Middle Ages begin around the time of about 700, 800 AD by many calculations and concludes around 1300 to 1400 AD, just prior to the Reformation. And that the manuscripts are from that period of time, the Hebrew manuscripts. And then in 1st and 2nd Samuel, because it can sometimes have over 60, then they use per multi, meaning an abundance, far more than many manuscripts, 60 plus. These statistics, these abbreviations are given in the introduction, the preface to your Hebrew Bible. You'll go through the various prefaces and prolegomena, and you come to a list of signs and symbols. And when you look under the listing for MS and MSS, then it will tell you how many times each of these, how many manuscripts are represented by these notations. There are also other volumes that you can get hold of that will give you the same information. There are various introductions to Biblia Hebraica, and there are also manuals on the texts and textual criticism, like the one by Brotzmann, one by Wertwein, and many others where you can go and obtain that kind of information. Any questions at this point? All right, let's move on then. I want to show you an example of how the textual critical apparatus works. Using the same passage, Joshua chapter 21, we're looking at that same kathif kare problem of Golan being spelled differently in the text than it is in the margin. And we see a superscript A over there inside that circle on the right-hand side there of the text. You have it there on the superscript on the left side of the word. And that tells you there is a textual critical note. So then you go down, this is in verse 27, you find verse 27 and the superscript A, and there you have the textual critical apparatus. And we'll take a look at that apparatus, back up here, and evaluate it. The Gothic C stands for Cairo Geniza fragments. MLT is many, meaning more than 20 if you're outside 1st and 2nd Samuel. And MSS, medieval Hebrew manuscripts. And then Septuagint is the Gothic G, standing for Greek. The MSS here, notice, is superscript. So this has to do with the variety of manuscripts of the Septuagint. The Gothic S stands for the Syriac Pashita. The Gothic T is for the Aramaic Targum. The Latin et is and. So it's continuing the note by saying that the Cairo Geniza fragments, 20 or more medieval Hebrew manuscripts, a variety of Septuagint manuscripts, the Syriac Pashita, and the Targum, the Aramaic Targum, and 1 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 56, read as the Kare. The Q here stands for Kare, and compare the textual note B in the textual critical apparatus in Joshua chapter 20, verse 8. And so that's what the textual critical apparatus gives you. It gives you that evidence, that amount of support. And as I mentioned to you before, this is known for being extremely inaccurate. And so before you use it or cite it, you always need to double check it with sources that are available in the library and from other reference works and from exegetical commentaries to make certain you have an accurate reading of what they're saying and that you have corrected it before you rely upon it. And then if you go to the next reading, which is the B, next in the line, you go over there and it's on the word ba'eshtara. And as you look at the B rating, the double vertical line divides the two sets of readings. The B reading, Syriac Pashita has as 1 Chronicles 6:56, Ashtoret. And that then is the extent of that note. But that's how you refer to, that's how you read the textual critical apparatus. How many of you had OT 603 and did the exercise for reading the textual critical apparatus? Okay. Almost half. That's good. All right. If you haven't been there yet, this will be one of your exercises in OT 603 in Introduction to Hebrew Exegesis. There's also what is called the Messora Finalis. We had the Mesora Major, we had the Mesora Parva, the minor Mesora. Now we have the Messora Finalis, the final Mesora. At the end of every biblical book in the Old Testament, there is a Mesora note that tells you how many verses are in that book and sometimes tells you which is the middle word of the book. So Sekum HaPesukim Shel Sefer is the total of the verses belonging to the book of Joshua in this case. Shesh Meot, 600, Wechemeshim, and 50, Weshisha, and 6. So 656 verses in the book of Joshua. Why? So that a scribe would have to sit down and count the number of verses in the book of Joshua to find out if any had been omitted. Had the Leningrad Codex B19A scribe done that, he would have found that he omitted verses 36 and 37 in chapter 21. Obviously, he did not do that, or someone else did not do it, because there's no notation on the manuscript, either in the margin or anywhere, that indicates that problem. And so it's one of those things you have to be cautious of then. What kind of care was put into the production of a manuscript? And then, in addition to telling us the total verses, it says, and its middle, wechetzao, and its middle is umecheshbon. That is the actual Hebrew word in chapter 13, verse 26. That is the middle word of the book of Joshua. How would you like to be the scribe, given the assignment, to start counting the words, starting with the last word, and starting at the first until you found the middle word? And what if you came up with a different word than you were supposed to? They probably made you count it again and again, and if you kept coming up with the wrong word, then that indicated that somewhere there was a mistake in the manuscript. And then you'd have to find where the mistake was. And that mistake, if it was minor, could be corrected, and the manuscript might still be used in the synagogue. But if it was a major omission, it would not be legitimate to use in the synagogue. It would then be put in the Geniza, given an honorable burial, so that it would not be used again. With what we can do with computers today, it's absolutely amazing that they sat down and did all this by hand and eye, going through the books. The last notation is with Sedarim, the number of Seders, the Sabbath readings in the book of Joshua. A 5 with a dot, a yod with a dot means 15, 5 plus 10. If they put it the other way, 10 plus 5, it would look like Yah, the divine name. Therefore, they would never do that. They either reversed it or they would change and put 9 plus 6. Taith, wow, would indicate 15. So they avoid profaning the divine name by using it for a number or giving the appearance of profane. Okay? 15 Seders, 15 lessons for Sabbath lessons in the book of Joshua. So divide up into those readings. Let's take an example and follow it through and talk about it and talk about what implications it has for interpretation. 1 Samuel 6:19 contains a problem that we mentioned earlier. It has to do with the 50,070 men who died because the men of Beit Shemesh had looked into the Ark of the Covenant while it was with them. Remember, it had been taken by the Philistines, lost in battle, when Eli was the priest, the prophet, the guardian of the tabernacle. His sons were evil men, and when the ark went out with Israel to battle, the Philistines defeated them, captured the ark, put it in the temple of Dagon, and you remember what happened from there, and eventually the Philistine population of the cities where the ark was taken came up with terrible problems, variously interpreted as either hemorrhoids or some sort of plague. And so therefore they finally decided to get rid of the ark, and they sent it back to Israel. They put it on a new cart with heifers on it who had never been milked. That comes from an old Greek practice, and the Philistines came from the Greeks. They came out of Mycenae and migrated through Crete and Cyprus into Asia Minor and down the coast toward Egypt, settling many of them in Palestine, where the name Philistine is given to the name of the area, Palestine. It's the same thing, Philistine, Palestine. And these groups were Greek in origin. They had some Greek practices. The armor that Goliath has is identical to the armor of Ajax and Achilles at the Battle of Troy that is described by Homer. And we also have this identical practice of moving a valuable religious object on a new cart with heifers that have never been milked in a Greek legend that predates the time of 1 Samuel 6:19. And so we know that this was a Greek practice then that the Philistines were falling back on. And then they went ahead then and sent this ark on its way. And the Lord, in his providence, allowed it to come to Beit Shemesh, where it was kept then. But then the men of Beit Shemesh began to look into the ark, to treat it with curiosity and not with reverence. Remember, Uzziah had reached out and tried to balance the ark when he thought that the oxen stumbled and the ark was going to fall over, and he was slain by the Lord. And yet that was not sufficient warning, evidently, to treat it as it ought to be treated with reverence. And so with the disrespect shown to the Ark of the Covenant, then we're told in this passage that the Lord smote among the men of Beit Shemesh because they looked into the Ark of Yahweh. Thus he smote among the people 70 men, 50,000 men. And the people mourned because Yahweh had smitten the people with a great smiting, literally. All right? So as we look at this, we see the numbers. Shivaim is 70, Ish, men. Chemashim is 50, Eleph is 1,000, and Ish again. So it's kind of an unusual wording. 70 men, 50,000 men. It's perhaps a little bit unusual, but it's not rare. It is found like this in other passages of Scripture. But the question is it an accurate number? Well, our question is there textual critical support for changing this number? Many commentators say that this is impossible. They say, look, in the whole history of Beit Shemesh, just taking the archaeological evidence, there were never more than 25,000 men, women, and children in Beit Shemesh and its surrounding villages. So how can you kill 50,070 men? And so they question the text, they question the accuracy of the text, and many of them will say it should be just 70 men, that the 50,000 should be eliminated. Well, before we would do such a drastic thing, let's first of all look at the textual evidence and see what the textual critical evidence is. We know what the Masoretic text says. Is it supported elsewhere by other witnesses? We've noted the repetition of Ish for men. We note the absence of a conjunction between the two phrases. It doesn't say 70 men and 50,000 men. So that has to be taken into account. And then we look at the textual critical apparatus of BHS. And as we look at that, the D's mark off a phrase of the 50,000 men. And we go down and it says in D's, it is absent in a few medieval Hebrew manuscripts, meaning 3 to 6 for 1 and 2 Samuel, rather than 3 to 10 elsewhere. So a maximum of 6 Hebrew manuscripts. But we know that because of the numbering of manuscripts and the recording of them for 1st and 2nd Samuel, that there are over 60 manuscripts because it had to have the special notations that allowed for that. Rather than saying 20 or more, we had to have the ability to say 60 or more. And so there are more than 60 manuscripts, medieval Hebrew manuscripts of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So let's take the maximum that this PC manuscripts can refer to, which is 6. Let's take the minimum number of manuscripts, medieval Hebrew manuscripts, for 1st and 2nd Samuel. Let's stay with the 60, since there's at least 60. There are more, but we'll stick with the minimum. And that says then that giving the benefit of the doubt to the furthest extent mathematically on both ends, no more, a maximum of 10% of the medieval Hebrew manuscripts on 1st and 2nd Samuel delete 50,000. That is not adequate evidence on which then to delete it ourselves and omit it in our translations. The first thing we would have to do is to go find out what manuscripts are we talking about. Do they involve any of the major manuscripts that we would look at as major textual witnesses in the Masoretic text? Number one. Where are these manuscripts? What are the kinds of manuscripts they are? Are they complete or partial? Are they the type that are accurate or inaccurate? Do they have many corrections? Do they have few corrections? Do they appear to be part of a tradition or a certain line or family of manuscripts? How old are they? Who produced them? All of these things have to be evaluated because you don't count manuscripts, you weigh manuscripts. You have to look at them for their value. And so in doing that, we'd have to pursue that to get all the evidence. But initially, we've got a pretty good clue here. There's not probably going to be very much evidence to alter the text, at least from the medieval Hebrew manuscripts. Notice here that Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia gives no other textual evidence for making the change. No versional evidence. Nothing from the Greek Septuagint, nothing from the Vulgate, nothing from the Syriac Pashita, nothing from the Aramaic Targums would indicate that a change should be made. But just because they did not indicate it does not mean we are free from checking ourselves, because we're in pursuit of truth, and we already know that BHS's manuscript evidence and its data can be skewed, misread, inaccurate, and misleading. So we're going to double check it ourselves. By the way, we'll look at the E while we're at it here before we leave. That's after Chemashim. And that indicates that a few or some manuscripts, 7 to 15 medieval Hebrew manuscripts, put a wow on Chemashim and make it and 50. Remember, we noted the text doesn't have the wow conjunction, doesn't have and. Well, a few, 7 to 15, which would be a maximum on the same figure there, a maximum of 25% of the medieval Hebrew manuscripts add that conjunction. It doesn't change the meaning. In fact, if anything, it says the number is as it is and ought to be maintained as it is, if you're looking at what it does for the number. It also says CITT. That stands for Various Citations in Medieval Rabbinic Literature. Commentaries by rabbis, sermons by rabbis, other interpretations by rabbis, maybe a commentary somewhere else that refers back to this verse. They have added the wow, but after all, that's going to be translated into Aramaic or Yiddish, and therefore they're just doing what is natural for the language. It's translational, perhaps. So that's not heavy evidence. We can compare the Septuagint, Syriac, and Vulgate, which we will do, because they all do add an and, probably because of the nature of those languages, requiring an and in numbers. So we'll take a look at each of those. We take a look first at the Septuagint. We'll take Rolf's edition of the Septuagint, which is a very popular edition. It is not a text-critical edition. It primarily represents Codex Alexandrinus, and Codex Alexandrinus alone, with a few sometimes notes given at the bottom of the page to tell us about Codex Sinaiticus or Codex Vaticanus. But as we look at it, we find out it says the same thing. It has hebdamekanta andros, 70 men, kai pentekanta, that's and 50, kiliadas, 1,000, andron men. Notice the things that occur. 70 men and 50,000 men. We maintain the Hebrew duplication of the noun. Ish in the Hebrew is duplicated here by the use of aner in the Greek. We have a conjunction added. To make it smoother Greek, it is more natural Greek to use a conjunction in a number like this. It is unnatural for Greek to omit a conjunction. Note the apparatus of the Cambridge Septuagint, because we know that Rolf's is not a critical apparatus text, and we want to pursue the truth, and we want to know what's the manuscript evidence, if any, for any change in this text in the entire Septuagint tradition, in all the collection of Septuagint manuscripts that we have available today, somewhere in excess of 5,000 or 6,000. So we go to the Cambridge Septuagint. The Göttingen Septuagint is another text we could go to. Notice it has a huge textual critical apparatus on 1 Samuel 6:19 and its context, 19, 20, 21. So we blow that up so we can see it. We look at the text as we have it, and we go down and take a look at the textual critical apparatus. We find out that the 70, all the way from hebdamekanta, all the way to andron, the entire phraseology is being commented on. Everything in the green box is there under the red line at the beginning. And we have one manuscript that says here, manuscript D, and some have indicated that perhaps this is intended as a manuscript here, and in my checking that, that is perhaps an abbreviation for everything in between. And this 1,000 here, and the ha on the end, there's a difference in order, is all, and it's in a very minor Hebrew minuscule manuscript of late date. And it doesn't change the number, it just changes the order. Andron kiliadas pentekanta kai hebdamekanta is the type of reading that is found, and that type of reading is also found in manuscript 44, a little bit more dependable manuscript in the history of the Greek Septuagint, and a known family of texts, and yet it still maintains 50,070. There's no doubt about it. Then we go to the Arabic, the Old Arabic, and the Ethiopic are checked, and the Latin translation for those are given here. Why? Because the Old Arabic and the Ethiopic depended upon known Greek Septuagint texts. So they are testimonies of what the Greek text was at the time they did their translations, because that's what they based their translations on. And in Latin is given here 50,070 men. So it confirms from those old translations based upon the Greek that the Septuagint tradition supports the 50,070. Looking further at the 70, we find out that in at least one manuscript and notation in a Greek edition, that it's preceded by ace. Here the preposition unto or into, perhaps to imitate the beith preposition in the Hebrew that indicates the direct object, that he smote 50,070 men, and there's a beith preceding it in the Hebrew, and here it's talking about smiting the people with a beith before it, so that here the beith is translated by an ace, but it doesn't change the number. After andros, it is put in one text, two texts, C and X, minor texts. The chi is omitted in two texts. In other words, it reads just like the Hebrew in two of the texts. 50,000 men is changed to 5,000 in those same two manuscripts. Out of over 5,000 Septuagint manuscripts, only two very minor manuscripts changed the 50,000 to 5,000, so it reads 5,070. And then the 1,000 men, the andron becomes then kiliadas ek tu lau, out of the people. That doesn't change the number. The ek tu lau doesn't change the number. So a change in number occurs in only two very minor manuscripts. and it changed it to 5,070, which could be a very simple error. There is virtually no evidence in the Septuagint tradition in all of its manuscripts for deleting the 50,000 and making it only 70 men. Well, we go further. We check the Syriac Pashita. The Syriac Pashita was begun translation about 125 AD. It's the first translation of the entire Greek Bible, Old and New Testaments, into a Semitic language, another language, a non-biblical language. And in the Syriac Pashita, it has Hemisha Elefin Ushevein Givrin, 50,070 men. Notice the altered order of the Hebrew. Notice the use of only one reference to man and the use of a conjunction. But it does not change. And this is in a textual critical edition put out by the Pashita Institute in Leiden, the Netherlands, and has a full textual critical apparatus for all known Syriac Pashita manuscripts. There is absolutely no evidence of a change in the Syriac tradition. They've added, the only thing they've done in the entire verse is to add Maria to the text, which is this word right here, to say that Maria, that's the word they use for Lord. That's the word for Lord, and represents Yahweh. But they add that in where it isn't in the Hebrew to make certain that the subject was clear. Shows you a little bit of the translation philosophy. But that's about it. No other changes. We go to the Latin Vulgate, and we check it. And we find in the Latin Vulgate, et percussit de populo septuaginta viros et quinquaginta milia plebis. And that says, and he struck the people, or out of the people, 70 men and 50,000 people. Very slight change there, a little bit of difference. From viros, men, to plebis, citizens or people. And in the textual critical apparatus of the major textual critical volumes on the Septuagint, or on the Vulgate, there is no indication of any variant readings. They maintained the Hebrew duplicate noun, but not with identical nouns, some form of variety, perhaps some way of trying to explain, and employed a conjunction. And yet it's still 50,070. Some have suggested that the Vulgate translators, which would be the old Latin translators, then Jerome, and then the Roman Catholic Church at the time of the Reformation, tried to remove many of Jerome's translations from the Latin Vulgate and revert back to the old Latin of their choosing, because the Reformers were using Jerome's translation against the Catholic Church. And so they wanted to distance themselves from Jerome. And in trying to distance themselves from Jerome, they revised the text and went back. So it's hard to tell what the tradition is, where it came about and everything. There'd have to be a huge study done here. But some have suggested that the use of viros is that of the men of Bet Shemesh, 70 men were struck by the Lord, but of all the people of Israel, a total of 50,000 more were struck at the same time. And in my opinion, that is coming very close to a very potentially accurate and feasible solution to the whole problem. The only reason that people want to change this text is they cannot accept what they have because of the evidence, supposedly, that we have externally that's limited to Beit Shemesh. But what if we're wrong in limiting it to Beit Shemesh? It does use the term people here rather than men of Beit Shemesh. And Shei Bet Shemesh is used at the beginning of that they looked into the ark and God smote of them 70 men, but it also talks about him smiting among the people, Ba'am. And this could be a reference to the people of Israel as a whole. Remember that you have plagues. For example, we talked about the census done by David. David is the one who committed the sin against God in making the census of the people. And yet over 20,000 fellow Israelites died. Why? Because David's sin was merely representative of the rest of the people. It was the last straw, so to speak, and God then sent a plague to punish the people. He'd had enough. He's not going to let it go any further. We see that a number of times in the Old Testament, where you have one individual or a group of individuals who are the guilty culprits of the immediately seen catalyst for this judgment in the immediate context. That is the apparent reason. But it's the entire people that suffer. And if we take it that way, then that makes perfect sense. That the men of Beit Shemesh were no more sinful or worse than the rest of the people of Israel. And because of their disrespect for the Ark of the Covenant, God then judged the entire nation for their lack of sanctification, for their lack of holiness in their walk, their lack of faith in God, and the plague took a total of 50,070 lives. I think that's a perfectly feasible response. There's no reason for us to change the text. Yes, question.
In regards to the explanation, would it be okay to say that the 50,000 as well also had some representative, like the 70 looked into the ark and that was representative of their hearts. Would it be fair to say that the 50,000 that died would have had something, although it's not looking into the ark, that showed their disrespect? It was merely a heart issue, and if it was my neighbor that died, I would have wondered why they died. Would that have been one?
It's a good question. Do we have any implication, any evidence or any indication that perhaps there was a similar type of concrete incident that would be the catalyst for the judgment of the remainder of the people elsewhere throughout the country? We have no indication of that necessarily, other than the general indication throughout the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel of a general tone of disobedience among the people. So we know it existed. We have individual cases that are focused on in the book of Samuel, starting with the sons of Eli, for example, and going even to the sons of Samuel later. We have Saul, who's disobedient. We have a number of cases, but there's nothing that we could really put our finger on and say definitely. And in those cases, if we're going to speak theologically, would God demand that there be an equivalent? Not necessarily. We'd have to say and talk about, well, then would God spare those who were truly innocent, or would they just be caught up in the disaster and affected by it and die anyway? Well, that's in God's hands, and he will be just. He will do that which is right. Even if a believer dies, remember, some believers are allowed to die at certain times so that they're preserved from seeing and experiencing further evil and living with that frustration and difficulty the rest of their lives. We have an example of that in Isaiah talked about with one of the kings, a young king, allowed to die so he would not see evil. We have examples we can go to throughout the Old Testament of how God did preserve. Go to the situation with Korah and the rebellion in the book of Numbers in chapter 16. And there you find out that all those that were with Korah, the earth swallowed up and they died. But you get back to chapter 26 and you find out it said that their families were gathered with them there outside their tents. And we assume after reading Numbers 16 that his children and family died also. But we get to Numbers chapter 26 and we find out that his sons were spared. They survived. They lived because God saw something good in them, because they did not deserve that judgment, and he had a purpose for them. And they became the line that produced the Psalms of the sons of Korah that we have in the Psalter. They were given a role in temple worship and in the tabernacle worship before that. And so there are cases then when we see that God can sovereignly choose to either allow a believer to die in the midst of a huge plague or judgment, or he might choose to deliver and save some. And that would be up to him as to how and why he does that. But both occur. So we'd have to leave the option open. We can't just give it a blanket statement and say all 50,070 were wicked. Nor can we say that all those who were righteous escaped. That'd be hard to say. We don't have enough evidence. Yes?
You know what's the reason ESV omitted 50,000?
Good question. Why did the ESV leave out 50,000? Because the translators that worked on the text of 1 Samuel in the ESV violated the standards of protocol that were set for the translators that worked by in the ESV translation, which is one of the reasons why I do not recommend using ESV as a pew Bible or pulpit text until it's gone through a revision, a major revision. It's gone through some minor revisions in the last few years, but it hasn't gone through a major revision. And it's not until it makes a major revision that we will finally see which direction it's going to go. Is it going to continue with these few translators who disobeyed the standards that were given to all of us to work under and violated the text without textual evidence? They were told to stick with the Masoretic text unless there was dominating textual critical evidence to the contrary. And yet there were some in Psalms and some in Samuel where the translators took it under their own device to change. The major editors allowed it to stand. And that troubles me. That troubles me greatly. I was a member of the team. I worked on the book of Job. And I feel the book of Job was handled quite well in their overall editing, the way they maintained sticking to the text and everything. There's a few questions I had here and there on the choices they made in where they overruled some of the decisions I made on translation. But basically, I was pretty pleased, very happy. And I'm happy with a large amount of the ESV. But these amounts of textual variations that are in violation of the standards that we were said to work by and are given in the introduction to ESV are very troubling. And I do not like to see that. And I want to see where it's going to head from here before I would use it in the church wholesale. Use it as an independent study Bible for your own? Yes, fine. But I would not use it as a pew Bible and have all the people at church using it until you see which direction it's going to take. All right? Good question. Good observation. But what they did is they just left out 50,000. As we saw, there is no significant textual evidence to leave out 50,000. That is a misrepresentation of the evidence. Yes?
Notice that in the ESV they actually footnoted that 70 men or 50,000 people. So what does that mean when they say, well, in the Hebrew it says this?
What they're saying is the Masoretic text says that, but they are disagreeing with the Masoretic text by the translation given in the body. They're just letting you know that what the Masoretic text said, which you have to appreciate at least that honesty, right? So, but I just don't like the direction of the choice. All right? Good question. Be aware of those things. All right? So our bottom line conclusion is we have no basis to change that text. There is so little evidence supporting a change, and if we're going to follow that minute and minuscule evidence for making that change, we need to then do the research to go further. And I can guarantee you the ESV translators did not do that research to find that out. What are those manuscripts, 3 to 6 medieval Hebrew manuscripts that have the change and what are that? I can pretty well guarantee they never even checked. They did not see. In fact, they may have relied totally and solely upon the textual critical apparatus in BHS and may not have checked any other possible areas where they perhaps should have. I was surprised to find out that some members of the team were not aware of the inaccuracies in the Stuttgart text, in spite of the fact of all the reviews that have been done of it and all of the writing that's been done and published in the periodical literature over the last 15 years or 20 years on it. There are some that are just totally unaware of that. And I think most of it are the younger men who grew up with only knowing Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, whereas those of us who grew up with the Biblia Hebraica Kittel and understood that and then hoped for a change and were disappointed by not having the accuracy we looked for. And of course that's when it first came out is when all those reviews are written. So then you have men come along that weren't even born when those reviews are written, and they have teachers evidently who did not take care to inform them adequately, or they did not listen carefully enough, one of the two, or did not do adequate research and reading and have just passed on that error. So watch out for that very carefully. All right. The significant medieval Hebrew manuscripts, British Library Codex Orientalia 4445 is the oldest one, 820 to 950 AD. The Aleppo Codex AD 930, and Codex Leningradensis B19A is AD 1008. Now, Codex Leningradensis B19A is the base text for Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. That is the text, that is the manuscript that is represented. Because we said last week, biblical Hebrew editions follow one manuscript and only one for the body of the text. All suggested changes must be put in the textual critical apparatus by the editors. They do not touch the text itself. They pass it on as they received it. The Aleppo Codex is missing everything from Genesis 1:1 up into Deuteronomy chapter 27 because the Arabs, in revolt against the partition of Palestine in 1947, burned down the synagogue at Aleppo, and inside was this very important manuscript, and the fire destroyed almost all of the Pentateuch. And the Aleppo Codex is the foundation text for the Hebrew University Bible Project. And so when it comes to the Pentateuch, which will be the last that they do for their text, they have to reconstruct that text. How are they going to do it? They're going to go back, and they've already started collecting all the manuscripts of rabbinical sermons, studies, writings that were based on the text at Aleppo. So they're finding all the rabbis that went to Aleppo and utilized that text in the synagogue at Aleppo as the foundation text for their writings and for the things they did. And they're going to also try to find, because of peculiar differences in the Aleppo Codex from that of Glenn-Gradensis B19a that help to identify a family, they're looking for the same types of consistent changes or differences that would indicate manuscripts that were copied from the Aleppo Codex. And they're trying to collect them together. And then they will go from there to do a full reconstruction of the Pentateuch. Yeah. The question is, what is missing from the Aleppo Codex? Everything from Genesis 1:1 into some portion of Deuteronomy 27. PJ?
Who is doing this translation?
The Hebrew University. Hebrew University Project. Hebrew University Bible Project. Known usually by the acronym HUBP. Hebrew University. It was under the leadership of Moshe Goten-Gottstein and has passed on to other hands now, including Emmanuel Tove and other men like him who are diligently working. The project will not be completed within my lifetime nor yours, unless something really changes. Your grandchildren might have the opportunity of seeing the completed project if the Lord tarries, but otherwise it's going to be a long time. Quinta will be out far in advance of that, so at least we'll have something to work with in the meantime, but that text will not be available. Okay? Yes, Darren?
When you mentioned, is that like the ones you just mentioned for the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew University, are these typically liberals or conservatives? I'm wondering the same thing for the guys who did DHS and these kind of things. Where do they stand?
Okay, excellent question. Where do the men stand who are in charge of projects like Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, like Biblia Hebraica Quinta, like the Hebrew University Bible Project? Where do they stand theologically, philosophically? What kind of men are they? The men who have been gathered for these projects are primarily a mixed group of both Jews and Christians normally. They involve everything in the Jewish side from the Orthodox to the extreme liberal Reformed, the most liberal of the Reformed. And the same range can be said of the Christian side of it. Runs from Protestant to Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, runs to liberals, to neo-Orthodox, to I would say semi-evangelicals. There are very few solid evangelicals get involved or invited to participate in these projects. First of all, there are not that many evangelicals that are that conversant with the languages. Second, because there are not that many evangelicals that are interested in textual criticism and have become experts on it. And thirdly, because there is a prejudice against evangelicals in the scholarly community. They don't look at them as scholarly because they walk by faith, not by sight, to put it very biblically, because they will not accept scientific evidence. They will go so far as to accept, for example, the existence of miracles, which most of these men will say there's no such thing at all. accepting prophecy as real, and they'll say no, it's based upon the history already taking place, and the prophecy is written after the event already occurred. And so there's an extreme prejudice here that removes evangelicals. Jean Devard is the nearest to an evangelical, and I would not call him totally evangelical, but he's the closest one I've seen on any of these committees so far to what I would term at least semi-evangelical. Yes, Jeremy.
Well, that said, and given our understanding of the noetic like the sin and total gravity, then don't we have to conclude that, I mean, how can we hope that somebody who hates God and suppresses the truth on righteousness, shouldn't they have necessity corrupt the text and handle it wrongly? I mean, why do we trust them with that?
Okay, excellent question. Why do we trust men who are so theologically inaccurate and so theologically heretical with our texts and with what is being done? We don't trust them. Okay? We don't trust them. We keep an eye on them. We check everything they say. We watch carefully. It is possible for men who are unregenerate to do accurate, factual work, to record the data accurately, and that's the most we can expect. But when it comes to interpreting the data, there's no way we're going to accept their interpretation of the data. We will take the data and check the data first of all to make sure it's accurate, and then we will interpret the data ourselves on all of these. That's why when I send you to places like the International Critical Commentary or Hermeneia for textual critical material in a commentary, I tell you, look at the data they present, don't accept their interpretation. And so, you have to really watch that. And that's what we have to always keep in our mind. Gentlemen, you have the ability to make some of these decisions far more accurately than they because of, first of all, your willingness to allow the text to speak and accept it as prima facie evidence. And these men oftentimes have a hermeneutic of suspicion, of doubt, where they approach it saying, well, I don't believe it's the Word of God, and I don't expect it to be accurate anywhere. I expect it to be riddled with errors. And with that approach, you'll find what you're looking for. And so remember that. The same with any other tools you use. Whether it's a commentary, check the theological background of the individual. Double check what they say. If the people of Berea, the believers of Berea, were noble because they checked up on the Apostle Paul, then we ought to at least check up on those that are nowhere near being an Apostle Paul. All right? And that means you should be checking up on me. You should be checking up on your professors. You should accept the Word of God and the Word of God alone as your authority. Remember the 3 levels of authority we talked about? God and His inerrant Word, or is it going to be the church and its infallible quote-unquote popes, including pastors, elders, and teachers and professors in seminaries, human authority, or is it going to be man and his own self-styled sovereignty, the individual himself? Which is it going to be? It's got to be the first, not the second. So you're bound by ethics, by biblical theology, to test your teachers and your preachers, your pastors, and what they do with the Word of God, to check the Word of God to see whether or not these things are so.